He fell, I told the police. But 17 years later, the knock on my door brought the truth crashing back. Now Eric's voice is calling me, and the rocks won't stop hitting my window.
Thomas, it was so painful.
Hey guys, welcome back to Hauntingly Yours. Today's story left me utterly spellbound. It's written by Reddit user Villem, and it's a haunting exploration of guilt, regret, and the terrifying question, was it all in his head, or was something or someone reaching out from beyond? Let's dive in and uncover the truth together. It was 17 years ago. I was 10 years old when my parents took me and my best friend Eric on a hike up into the mountains. My parents and I had walked the route before, but I was still excited since Eric could come along. The route was about 7 miles long, which is a bit far for two 10-year-old boys to walk. But at the end of the route, there was this cabin that sold cakes and waffles, which was enough motivation for me and Eric to get through the entire hike without complaint. The hike started off with this long path that was relatively straightforward. The sun was out, and it was warm enough for me to go without a jacket. Eric did the same. About halfway through the hike, my parents decided to settle down and take a break. Eric and I were too pumped up with excitement to take a break, so we asked if we could go and play in the forest. My parents were reluctant since there was a cliff not too far away, but since we promised not to go near it, we got permission. After some rummaging around in the forest, we eventually went too far and stumbled upon the cliff. It was very steep, so I was too frightened to go near it. I told Eric that we should be getting back to Mom and Dad, but he wasn't as frightened as me. He tried to convince me that it wasn't as dangerous as my parents had told me. "Come on, they won't know if we don't tell them," he said. "It's still dangerous," I said. "Only if we slip." "Come on, I have something to show you," he said, as he went over to pick up a rock and proceeded to throw it over the cliff. "Look, isn't that fun? Let's see who can throw it the farthest," he said. I was still reluctant, but seeing that he managed to stand pretty firmly on the ground while throwing multiple rocks, I eventually got more confident. I then got an idea. I snuck up to the biggest rock I could find that also could fit in my hand and picked it up. I had planned to surprise him with the longest shot I could make. I got myself into position, hurled back my hand, and then flung the stone with all my strength. It was instantly followed by a thud and a blood-curdling scream of agony. I had hit Eric directly in his head. My entire body froze in panic. I could not believe what I had just done. Eric lay on the ground without saying a word, only moaning in pain. With a heart sunk in the pit of guilt, I apologized with the utmost sincerity, but it fell on deaf ears. To my horror, I realized the true state of the situation when I went over to him and saw his blood-red eye and sunken skull. His breath was frantic, filled with panic, pain, and confusion. I just stood over him, not knowing what to do. Frankly, there was nothing I could do. His breathing slowly stopped, and then he was dead silent. I fell back, too terrified to look at the scene. I turned my head and jumped in fright when I saw the glaring eyes of apprehensiveness coming from my father, who had just come to find us in this state. "I didn't mean to," I cried, curling up into a ball. From then on, I dissociated from the situation, overwhelmed by all my emotions. I only snapped back to reality when I saw my father, holding Eric in his arms, throw his body over the cliff. He looked back at me with a gaze that froze me to stone. Slowly walking up to me, he crouched down and grabbed my arms with a force he had never dared to use on me before. "You can never tell anyone about this. Do you hear me?" He shook me, trying to sober me up from the situation. He fell. That is what happened. He fell. The police recovered Eric's body and concluded that he died from a head injury caused by the fall. My mother, filled with guilt and sorrow, had begged on her hands and knees to Eric's parents for forgiveness. She did not receive it. She didn't get forgiveness from herself either for the trauma this had caused me. Both my parents became distant, my mother because of her guilt, and my father out of spite for what I had done. I remained mentally gone for 7 months, until my brain eventually figured out a way to bury the trauma. In the present, both my parents are dead. My father died of a heart attack 4 years ago, and my mother drank herself to death before that. Up until now, I have gotten used to living with what I have done. I sort of accepted that I couldn't do anything but move on and forget. It remained a distant memory that came up less and less as time moved on, until about a month ago, when I heard a knock on my door. I lived alone in a remote house near the sea. Receiving unexpected visitors was not something I was used to. I opened the door and was greeted by a police officer. "Good afternoon. Might you be Thomas Carter?" the officer asked. "Yes," I answered. "I am Officer Miller. I have come to ask some questions about an incident you witnessed when you were younger," he stated. "What incident?" I asked. "I am referring to an incident where you witnessed the death of Eric J. Adams," the police officer clarified. A jolt of anxiety hit me like a lightning strike. "Why?" I said meekly. "The police department has recently gotten into a scandal surrounding poor management of cases. Claims of insufficient investigation and unprofessional behavior have led us to reopen investigations that were concluded despite certain discrepancies in the evidence," the police officer stated. "Discrepancies?" I asked. I had no idea what the so-called discrepancies could be. "Yes, I was going to ask you to clarify some of them. Might I come in?" he asked. I let the officer into my house and asked him if he would like some coffee, to which he refused. He went over to my dining room table and told me to sit down. I followed his command, and he sat down on the other side of the table. "I read your testimony from 17 years ago. It was brief," he stated. Yes. At the time, I hadn't yet fully recovered from the situation mentally," I said. "Yes, the report said that you weren't in a stable enough state of mind to give a proper answer to any of the questions. The only clear thing you stated was that he fell," he said. "Yes, he did. He fell." The officer looked directly into my eyes, waiting for a moment before stating, "When asked how he fell, you didn't answer. You just repeated the same phrase, 'He fell.' Well, as I said, I wasn't entirely there in the head," I said. "But now you are. Here, in the head?" he asked, without breaking eye contact. I nodded. "How did he fall, Thomas?" I was not prepared to answer the question. Lying on the spot has never been a strong suit of mine. "Well, he slipped," I said regretfully. "He slipped? On what exactly?" he asked. "On the ground," I answered. "Why did he slip on the ground?" he asked. My mind was rushing for any explanation I could come up with, but my anxiety kept me from rationalizing my thoughts. Relying on my intuition to come up with an excuse, I stated, "Well, I think his shoelaces were untied, so, that's how he fell." "Okay. How did his untied shoelaces lead to him slipping?" he asked. "Well, what I meant to say is that he tripped," I answered. "Okay, so he tripped on his shoelaces, is what you're saying?" he asked. "Yes," I confirmed. He squinted his eyes while looking into mine and asked, "Are you certain?" "I am pretty sure," I answered. The officer continued to look into my eyes. "Why are you lying to me?" he asked. I was dumbfounded by the question. What? Last I checked the report, it said that Eric was wearing a pair of Nike shoes that use Velcro, not laces," he said. Yet again, I found myself completely dumbfounded. Why would he memorize something like that? "Are you sure?" I asked. "Positive," he confirmed. "You know, I just don't really remember what happened. It's all just a blur," I said, trying to recover from my mistake. "You're telling me that you forgot how your friend died right in front of your eyes?" he asked, unconvinced. "Well, it was 17 years ago," I answered. "So you remember exactly when, but nothing about how?" he asked. "Yes, I don't remember how," I answered more sternly, trying to sound assertive. We both sat in silence, looking at each other. "That's a pity," he said. After raising himself from his chair, he began to walk out the door. On his way out, he said, "It would have been easier to find out what happened if you could give an actual testimony." He looked back at me. "Don't worry, though. We have enough evidence to puzzle together what really happened." His look made me uncomfortable. I didn't look back. I just wanted him gone. Once the door closed behind him, I could finally breathe a sigh of relief and collect my thoughts. But then it hit me. I sprinted out the door and onto the porch as he was about to get into his car. "Hey, wait!" I yelled. He looked up and back at me. "What did you mean by discrepancies?" I asked. He studied my face for a second and then smiled with satisfaction. "I will see you soon, Thomas," he said. He sat down in his car and drove away. I walked back into my home and closed the door behind me. My entire body felt like it was tied to the ground, my heart beating 1,000,000 times per second. I let go of my strength and collapsed onto the floor, bawling my eyes out, overwhelmed by anxiety. My mind raced, trying to figure out what the so-called discrepancies were. Could it be that he wasn't thrown the right way? That the autopsy actually pointed towards him not getting the deadly strike from the fall? Or was it the testimony of me and my father that didn't correlate? After some time of thinking, it finally came to me. The rock. Did my father leave the rock at the scene? No, he couldn't have. He would have known it was dangerous to just leave it there. I went deep into my mind to try to remember what my father did that day, but all I could think about was Eric's lifeless body with an abhorrent dent in his head. I had buried that day so deep into my mind that I could not remember any details. The guilt crept its fingers around my heart, and I lay there on the floor, showing no signs of strength or integrity, submitting my entire soul to the ruthless torture of my conscience. After laying there for an hour, I eventually exhausted my emotions. I felt hollow, lifeless. Standing up, I thought of nothing else to do than to go to sleep, to reset my brain so it could deal with whatever it had to deal with. I walked into my bedroom and just collapsed onto my bed without taking off my clothes. I closed my eyes and waited for the soothing embrace of unconsciousness. Then, suddenly, thud. My eyes jolted open, and anticipation filled the room. I had clearly heard something, but silence was the only thing present. Assuming that it was nothing of importance, I closed my eyes again. It came from the window. I opened my eyes again. My window was situated on the other side of the room. Lying down in my bed, I could only see the sky through the window. Was there someone out there? Still, silence. I was beginning to suspect that I was going mad. It wasn't an unreasonable suspicion, considering the emotional shitstorm I had just gone through. Now I saw it. I clearly saw a small rock hit the window. Terror froze me in place. I didn't know who was throwing the rocks. My guts sank to the floor when a voice came from outside the window.
Thomas.
I hadn't heard his voice in such a long time, but I instantly recognized it. It was the voice of Eric. Another rock hit the window. I had had enough. This was clearly my mind just working tricks on me. I worked up the courage to get out of bed and show myself that there was nothing out there. I raised myself up from my bed, put my feet on the ground, and stood up. I walked slowly over to my window. The moonlight was shining through my window, illuminating everything outside it. The sea was to my right, and there was a grass-covered rock before me. There was no one outside my window. Breathing a sigh of relief, I concluded that my mind was just playing tricks on me. I turned around, ready to go back to bed, but I froze. On the wall in front of me, I could see someone's shadow. A small humanoid figure stood to my left, behind the window, behind me. Tears began to roll down my face. I could not believe my eyes. I had just checked, and there was no one outside.
Come outside, Thomas.
I did not want to go outside. I couldn't call the police either. I had already made them suspicious enough. The only thing left for me to do was lay back in bed and pray I could fall asleep. It continued like that the entire night. I couldn't get a single hour of sleep. Day came, and there were no more rocks hitting my window. Time went by, and for an entire month, I was pestered by stones hitting my window and whatever was out there, trying to lure me out. Yesterday was the day I had had enough. I decided I would go out and confront whatever was out there. It was the only choice I had. Night came, and I got ready. Standing in front of my door, I waited for a rock to hit my window. I braced myself for whatever was out there and opened the door to my house. Walking out, I could feel the cool air drifting from the sea, filling me with the smell of salt. Walking toward the edge of my house, where my bedroom window was, I yelled, "I am here now. What do you want?" Silence. I tried again. "I am here. Outside. What do you want from me?" There was still nothing. Only the soft wind and the waves on the sea. Standing right outside my window, I felt tired. I was tired of whatever was haunting me. Why couldn't I just move on? Why must I be condemned for a mistake I made 17 years ago? Was I not just a child? Am I liable for the mistakes I made at such an age? Suddenly I could hear the same blood-curdling scream I'd heard 17 years ago from behind me. My body collapsed from the sudden fright, and all the buried emotions from the past were released into my soul. Laying on the ground, I turned around and saw him. He was standing in front of me. His head was still dented, and his eye was still bloody.
It was so painful,
Eric said. Speechless, tears rolled down my eyes.
Why did you kill me, Thomas?
Eric asked. I don't know. I didn't mean to, I answered.
Why did you murder me? Why did you murder me?
He yelled. I tried to stand up, but I remained frozen. Eric was walking slowly toward me. With each step he took, his head grew bigger, and his legs and arms did the same. He started to tower over me with long, lanky legs and arms, his head twice as big as mine. He grabbed me by the chest and imprinted his fingers, now more like claws, into my chest. His blood-red eye began to bulge out of its socket. Then, his eye popped out and fell onto my lap. It was the size of a tennis ball. His empty eye socket began to leak blood and brain matter all over me. I tried to claw my way out of his grasp, but he was too strong. He opened his mouth so wide that the skin around his jaw ripped apart, and then he stuffed my feet into his mouth. I could slowly feel myself sliding into his belly. I screamed for help, but no one answered. Again, trying to free myself, I managed to turn onto my stomach. Tilting my head up, I could see the sea and 2 other human forms standing in the distance. I then realized it was my parents. "Mom, Dad, help me," I yelled. My dad turned his head toward me, and I could see the same look in his eyes that he had 17 years ago. He turned his head back, and they walked off into the ocean. Feeling completely hopeless, I let Eric consume me. Sliding deeper into his stomach, the last thing I saw was a glint of moonlight before I completely succumbed to the darkness. Day came, and I woke up on the ground outside my house. I was completely drenched in mucus and blood. Eric was gone. I walked back into my home and took a shower. In the shower, I finally got the peace and clarity I needed to think through everything, and realized what I had to do. That is where I am now. Writing this out has felt like £1,000,000 lifted off my shoulders. After publishing this, I will go to the police station and tell them exactly what happened. I don't know if I could be charged with manslaughter for something I did when I was 10, but whatever the consequences are, I will accept them. The guilt I bore festered in my soul, and it was time to cleanse it. And that's the haunting tale by Reddit user Villem. Thanks for listening to Hauntingly Yours. If you enjoy these stories, please like and subscribe to keep them coming. And don't forget to comment. I love hearing from you. Until next time, this is your very own Mr. Hauntingly Yours, signing off for the night.